So in Decline of the West, we're on chapter 11. There are 14 chapters total, so we're nearing the end here. And chapter 11 is letter B on the state in history. And what Spengler does in this chapter is he gives his overarching evolution of the phases of political forms in this chapter, the evolution of the state, basically. And we had said that Spengler's model, in terms of its overarching arc, has four distinct phases: the pre-culture period, an early culture period, a late culture period, and a civilization phase. And each one of these stages has substages. The early culture period has 2 substages, the late culture period has 3 substages, and the civilization phase has 3 substages as well. So we have a total of 8 stages, 9 if you count the pre-culture period. Then I want to go through these substages in a little bit of detail. So with civilization, then we have the early culture, the pre-cultural period, which is the period of tribes. There is no sense of a nation yet in this phase. There is no sense of a state. The estates of the nobility and the priesthood have not yet arisen, and what we have are tribes roving across the landscape. They have no relationship to that landscape. There's no sense of rootedness. It's like Deleuze's smooth space that the nomad roams across. Cities are merely appear in this landscape as mere striations in his path. And the basic tribal structure is usually the idea of descent from a common ancestor, so there's very often a tribal, a blood consanguinity that's shared amongst the members of the tribe. So we have this period of, this is the period of Mycenaean times, this is the period of the Tinnite times and the early dynasty 0 of the Egyptian civilization. This is the period in China, the early Shang dynasty period, and in the West, of course, this is the period of the Franks and the Visigoths and the Lombards, the these ones and the those ones. But then this period begins to shift with the creation about in the Faustian civilization from 900, right about the year 900, to the rise of, with the first estates, the nobility and the priesthood, and the creation of feudalism. We have the beginnings of the springtime, which is to say the early culture period. And the early culture period has to do with the creation of feudalism, in which now we have a very specific and concrete relationship to the land. And so the tribes of the Franks and the Lombards and the Visigoths now become Germans, French, Spaniards, Italians, and so forth, with the creation of feudalism, which is based on a pyramidal hierarchy in which we have vassals who swear oaths of fealty to their overlords in return for performing a service, usually of a military, but not always of a military nature for their overlords, who provide them with protection. And the overlords then grant them a fief, which is to say land for the purposes of tilling and owning. And the king is at the top here. If we think of Vico's evolution in his model from theocracy, where every civilization moves through theocracy, aristocracy, democracy, and then a recurso of chaos, Spengler's model is very similar to this idea. The feudal period is the theocratic period in which we have patriarchal forms. The king is the main overlord governing the entire society. In the Faustian civilization, the papacy, we have the struggle during this period. This is from 900 to about the 15th century, of the struggle between empire and papacy, in which the Pope himself tried to become the overlord with all the states, the nation-states of Europe, his vassals. He basically, the Norman Sicily and Norman England swore oaths of fealty to the Pope as though he were their overlord. And this structure gradually begins to change over time. With the rise of the Magna Carta in 1215, we can begin to see in England the beginnings of the limitation of the power of the king and the rising power of the nobles. The nobles come out of the vassals, and then we begin to get into a period of wars, the Wars of the Roses, all of the chaos that begins to go on in the 13th century, and which lasts all through the 14th century, which indicates, as Carol Quigley puts it, the instrument of expansion becomes institutionalized. In this case, the instrument of expansion, feudalism, becomes institutionalized into chivalry, and war becomes the primary means of fueling this now disintegrating economic structure. And so that's the first phase of the early culture political model. The second phase then is the descent into the first interregnum, there comes an interregnum period in which feudalism crumbles and disintegrates, the power of the nobles rises, they begin to become stronger and stronger. In Egypt we can see the entire Old Kingdom period, Spengler says, is a period of feudalism, such that by the end of that period, in the 5th and 6th dynasties, we can see the power of the nobles there rising, decentralizing Pharaoh's power, and then we have the descent into the First Intermediate Period, which is a period of chaos, of nobles and princes warring against each other in a period of anarchy for possession over their landscape. In England and in Germany in 1254, we get the interregnum there in Germany, and in China we also get an interregnum in China that occurs about 842 BC, roughly in there. So in each case we get the dissolution of feudalism with the rise now of the state. The state itself begins to become a power unto itself, and with that this signals the shift from the early culture period to the late culture period. The first phase, of which there are 3 subphases here, is indeed the creation of the class state. In Europe, this is the great period where the first grand statesmen begin to appear. The nobility takes center stage. The powers of the king begin to fade off. We get grand statesmen such as Cromwell, Richelieu, Wallenstein, and we can think of Cromwell leading the army of Parliament against King Charles as the inevitable outcome of a process of limitation of the king's powers that had begun with the Magna Carta. We can see this process happening. This is what Spengler calls the period of the formation of the Frondes, these grand states of form which come into being in France and in England, and we get the period of these great statesmen. We also have here in Egypt, we have the Middle Kingdom, of course, coming into being at this time, specifically the 11th dynasty, where we get the Montuhoteps, Montuhotep 1, 2, and 3, Intef 1, 2, and 3, and we get this sort of police state mentality in the Middle Kingdom in which the pharaoh re-centralizes all the powers back to himself. We get in this period also the creation of the judgment of the dead as a punishment for those nobles who had in the previous period pulled and disintegrated the old kingdom apart, and the creation of a very, very strong centralized state. The rise of the state, it gets stronger and stronger, and the nobles begin to become concerned with the creation of dynasties, especially in the West during this period. This is the period of the protectors in China, and the first Tyrannus, which begins to come in the classical Greek world. And this is also the period of the Tarquins, the kings of Rome, who begin to lose their power in this period with the expulsion of the Tarquins. Then we move into the middle phase of this period, which is the rise of the absolute state. The absolute state comes into being as a strict form. This is the 12th dynasty in Egypt, which is the great high political period in Egyptian civilization. And this is the period of the rise in Rome of the tribunate of the plebes, which begins to come into its own consciousness of its powers in opposition to the patricians. The entirety of Roman history is characterized from henceforth as the battle between the plebeians and the patricians, or the tribunes and the senate. This will characterize Roman history right down to the coming of the Caesars. In China we have the spring and autumn period that comes into being here, and in the Faustian civilization, this is the period of Louis XIV and grand statesmen like Frederick the Great. So this is the great high period of statesmanship, where the society is in form. Spengler borrows this term from sports. When an athlete is in form, he is at the top of his game. And so likewise, in this middle period of the late culture stage, states are in grand form. There's an art of cabinet politics and diplomacy. It's a very grand high style. Then with the third phase of this, we begin to see the disintegration of the state into Napoleonism. This begins to express itself inwardly with the rise of social revolutions and the internal side of the state. We get the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and externally in the phenomenon of Napoleonism, where the state expands geographically and it begins to lose its sense of form and also its respect for form and tradition. Napoleon is the one who begins to introduce for the first time all-out warfare. He marches, he attacks at night, attacks during the winter. He violates all these classical rules of battle, which were part of being in good form. He's the first to begin this process of liquidating all these traditional formal rules of combat and battle. Technology begins to come in with Napoleon in a new, important way. And so this period begins the liquidation of the great state, and this corresponds in Egypt, of course, to the coming of the Hyksos. They come in and they flood. They set up a capital in Lower Egypt at Avaris, and they flood in, set up their capital. They're led by a general named Cayenne, who conquers Egypt. And in the 4th century, we get the second Tyrannus, but also the rise of Alexander the Great, who is, of course, the equivalent to Napoleon in that civilization. And then in China, we begin to get the period of the contending states in its early form, along about 480 BC, which lasts from about 480 to about 220 BC, and then we begin to get the dissolution of the state there. And with that now, with this period of destruction, we begin to get the transition from the late culture period to the rise of civilization, which again has 3 stages. So now, with the first of these stages in the civilization period, we have what in China is called the period of the contending states, where now we have the rise of annihilation wars. We have all-out warfare practiced. We have states that are for the first time ever completely liquidated. The Chinese liquidated the state of Wu, which previous chivalric codes of honor would have prevented in earlier dynasties. Then we begin to move into the annihilation wars, in which Carthage must be destroyed. The idea of completely liquidating and eliminating the enemy begins to come in. Technology begins to come in a supreme way. You can see this coming in the American Civil War with the use of the railroad, the Gatling gun, the Ironsides battleships, and the first attempts to use submarines, new ballistical missiles with conical-shaped bullets, rifle magazines, all this new technology that comes in. Same thing in the period of the contending states. Along about the 5th and 4th centuries in China, we begin to get the use of iron implements and weapons and new kinds of siege warfare. The crossbow begins to come in. All this stuff begins to take place there. And this is the period of the contending states. In Egypt, this is the period of the expulsion of the Hyksos, which is the wars between the Theban warriors led by the pharaohs Ahmoses and Ka-Moses, who expel the Hyksos, chase them out, and begin the process of creating the empire. So this period of contending states, which in our case corresponds to the world wars, these annihilation wars, in which you get the firebombing of Germany as the equivalent to the fact that Carthage must be destroyed, and the 3 Punic Wars, begins to signify then the transition from Napoleonism to Caesarism. The middle phase of the civilization period then is the phase of Caesarism. Now we get the Caesars on stage, and the universal state begins to solidify and come into being as a result of this. And what we have now is a kind of formless state. It's a universal state, but it's formless, and it's governed by incidental men of military genius who are begin to form private armies, as Marius did in Rome. This is the period of the disintegration of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Caesars. First, the civil wars between Marius and Sulla. Marius coming out of the tradition of the tribunes, Sulla representing the tradition of the patricians. We get these civil wars, and then with the coming of Caesar, Caesar was a relative of Marius, and he comes out of the tradition of the tribunes. And then we begin to get the creation and the reversion back to pure zoological power struggle, the ideas and ideals of democracy and money. In the civilization phase, as we had seen, money and intellect now begin to take center stage over the old estates of nobility and priesthood. Money begins to usurp the values of land. The great megalopolis comes into being, which is divorced from the landscape and any sense of relationship to the countryside. The traditions of the blood begin to thin and disintegrate, and the intellectual comes on stage, the demagogue, the one who begins to argue for world-reforming intellectual ideals that now begin to be made the actualization of democracy and constitutionality, the rights of man. All these artificial schemas, which are then fought for and over and realized, then begin to fade off with the coming of the Caesars, which in India is the rise of Ashoka in 220 BC, Qin Shi Huangdi in China at about the same time, the Caesars, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. In the Byzantine world, this is signified by the rise of or the Magian world, by the rise of the Sultanate. The Turks come in, and they create a universal state that conquers the whole Arabian world that had previously been the primary domain of the Abbasids, who had been centered in Baghdad. We recall that the Umayyad dynasty had come out of southern Arabia and had centered itself in Damascus and Jerusalem, and then later this would correspond to the period of the Francs, and then later with the Abbasids being centered in Baghdad, we would have the great megalopolitan period with the creation of Baghdad as the first great cosmopolis about 800 BC. But then with the coming of the Turks, all of this is conquered by force and blood, and we have the creation of the universal state in that case, beginning with Toghrul-Bek and his son Alp Arslan, who were the first great Caesars in that civilization. And then, of course, in Egypt, we begin to get the construction of the new empire under the 18th dynasty, which with Queen Hatshepsut